Oh, hi. I didn't freaking see you there. My name is Kelsey, and I am an actor and voice actor living in Chicago. And this is Chicago Reacts, where we all react to fun videos on the internet. Today, I'm going to be reacting to Was SCP Really That Hard to Kill After All? By SCP Explained Story and Animation. Now, I know all of y'all like SCP content, so I'm excited to get reacting to some SCP content. Yeah, let's get started.
Those blasted Foundation rats had done it again. SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile, sat in its tank of highly concentrated acid and seethed at the world it had been placed in. And what a miserable, terrible world it was. He hated it, and he hated every single soul that occupied it, and especially the hypocritical monsters in the lab coats that ran this sham of an organization. Whenever the reptile wasn't speaking, normally to bark threats and profanities at its human jailers, it was quietly listening, taking everything in, and how the things it heard made its blood boil more than the corrosive fluid forever eating into its carapace. What high-minded ideas these worthless apes had about themselves. We're cold, not cruel. What a sick joke. Every moment for the reptile was a different kind of hell. The baseline of existence was a certain dull, fizzling pain as he melted as quickly as his cells could divide. His only reprieve from this was being dragged into a testing chamber for some even worse pain. Perhaps burned, or sliced, or chewed at by a mutant rabbit, or crushed by bananas, or torn apart by wires and hooks, or beaten and bashed by some mad swordsman, or having his mind invaded and attacked by a rogue soul in a cursed necklace. If this was only cold, then the reptile hated to even imagine what the SCP Foundation considered cruel. After all, there were monsters more powerful than him out there. The Hanged King or the Devourer of Worlds could handedly destroy their wretched ball of rock.
I have not... So, back when, like, several years ago, when the SCP Foundation people started to, like, get into it, I didn't do the deepest dive ever, but, like, and of course now it's changed so much, and there are so many more SCPs and so much more lore, especially in the past, like, 3 years, and especially over the pandemic when people had time to explore that, and write stuff and create stuff. So I've heard of, like, some of these things they're talking about. Like, I've heard of the carapace one, I forget its name. But yeah. So it's going to be interesting. I'm going to be excited to see stuff that I recognize. But I haven't heard of 682 yet. Today.
If they so choose to. He wasn't the most sadistic or evil of the beasts these maniacs in white coats had faced. Those who warred with him met a quick death at his claws and fangs. Would that nightmarish old man afford his victim such a luxury? Or that unstoppable psychopath in the old police car? And yet, it was his file that bore the addendum, SCP-682 must be destroyed as soon as possible. And why? Seemingly only because he...
Okay, this design also is so fun. It reminds me of, I don't know if you all are familiar with Long Horse. It's supposed to be creepy, but I think it's cute. Look up Long Horse if you haven't yet. This reminds me of Long Horse for some reason. I don't know why.
He could take it. And the Foundation always had new toys it wanted to test on their favorite punching bag.
No.
Of course, he attempted to escape, but wouldn't you? Is freedom not an inalienable right?
No.
The Foundation would cry, but look at the terrible crimes he's committed. Look at the lives he's taken, as they always do. Let he who is without sin draw the first acid bath. He knew on some level if he were to make a tally, the Foundation's crimes would far outnumber his own. The only difference was that they deluded themselves into believing all acts of cruelty are permissible in service of their greater good. If they all had but one head, the reptile would claw it from their shoulders. A group of incredibly well-armed and well-armored guards entered the room, training all their weapons on him. He hadn't summoned the energy to escape today, and that meant only one thing. They were going to take another swing at killing him again. Oh, goody. Another attempt that would leave him momentarily in absolute agony and allow neither of them to gain any ground. He'd grown numb to attempts on his life by now. Whatever they had waiting for him in the other room, he'd be ready for it. The guards removed him from his acid bath, and while he was still trying to regenerate his muscles and nerves enough to move, they dragged him into the testing chamber. It was always a mystery, wondering what they'd be poking or prodding him with today. But when he was first dragged into the chamber, it was empty. Those were always the worst ones.
Oh, no.
When he was left some sitting duck waiting for the Foundation and their infinite malice to choose the form of the would-be destroyer, what would be behind door number 1? A box. A large wooden box was pushed into the room, and the door closed behind it. How curious. The hard-to-destroy reptile began to approach the box, sniffing at the air. It made no sound in there, but something about that smell. Something eerily familiar. It was different this time. With a soft pop, the box fell apart, its walls falling in different directions like the petal of a blooming flower. And the second the hard-to-destroy reptile saw what lurked inside, it felt an unfamiliar cold barb of terror hook into the soft, warm flesh of its heart. The thing inside the box had been called SCP-173 by the SCP Foundation, but that wasn't how the reptile knew it. It was a
Also, fun fact, that SCP, the image popularly used, I think was made by originally by a Japanese artist. And I read at some point, I wish I remembered his name, but I read at some point that it was like a whole thing. And I don't remember whether he absolutely loved and loves or absolutely hates. I think he said something like, "Oh, I'm glad my art is known. I just wish people knew it was my art instead of just associating it with this SCP." I think. But go look it up. It's whether I'm butchering the story or not, it's a really interesting one.
Primordial nightmare, an ancient horror, the stone devil, the killer in the dark, the Koitern, which had mercilessly and gleefully slaughtered so much of the reptile's very species, back when 682 was known as the Atanti Kilpenyo, and here it was, ready to finish the job. SCP-682 let out an involuntary screech of pure horror and fled backwards, keeping its eyes fixed on the monster at all times. He moved back until he hit the far wall of the containment chamber, until he could go no further.
Wait,
his mind was flooded.
Does he really not have eyes, though? Because if that's just like a design choice, then that the person animating this made. Hang on, my brain is doing something. Because the whole thing with 173, but is that if you blink, it's gonna go behind you and snap your neck real fast. But if he doesn't have eyes, how's he gonna do that? Oh, I guess it would either be he's always aware of his surroundings because, if he doesn't have eyes, which I don't know, again, if this is just a design choice and he's supposed to have eyes, we just can't see them. But if he doesn't have eyes, then I wonder if it's like a situation where he always knows what's going on, so the thing can't kill him, or he can't see anything ever, so the thing has every opportunity to kill him. But because of the fact that he's scared, I gotta assume it's the second one, right? Guess that's something I'll find out.
And his heart was racing. He never thought he'd see this monster again. He'd hoped it would never cross his path again. Perhaps he even held out hope that the abomination had been slain, destroyed, scattered to the winds. And yet here it was, looking at him. The reptile called out,
"You fools! You have no idea what you've done! This thing, mark my words, it will be your ruin. It will slaughter every single one of you."
But its appeals to reason with its captors, in their own interest for once, fell on utterly uninterested ears. 6 hours of this passed, the reptile spending every second of it for the first time in a long time fearing for his life. A group of observing Foundation scientists merely noted a peculiar reaction of distress from 682 and ordered a decorated mobile task force sharpshooter with a Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle with armor-piercing rounds to initiate Phase 2 of the cross test. In a sudden flash of sound and pain, the sharpshooter blew away both of SCP-682's staring eyes. The simultaneous instruction went out for all.
So it did have eyes. But it can regrow them, right?
Observing members of personnel to avert their gaze, just for a moment. 682 could certainly regenerate its eyes quickly, but nothing was quite as fast as an unobserved SCP-173. The reptile screeched in pain as it heard the monster snapping its body parts, leaving it thoroughly mutilated. When the group of observing scientists looked back, they saw it, which is to say SCP-173 standing before a heavily damaged SCP-682, as though incredibly proud of its handiwork. Internally, 682 thanked a creator it despised for the fact that the observers looked back and spared it from the onslaught that soulless stone monster had unleashed on it. A scientist working for the Foundation would later remark, "After review, it appears SCP-173 was unable to do lethal damage to SCP-682 due to a major difference in physical size. A possible repeat of this test may be made if SCP-682 is damaged enough to reduce its physical mass to a level equal with SCP-173. But 682 knew deep down this wasn't the truth. It had nothing to do with physical size. If the Koitern had truly willed it, he never would have left that room. The monster only wanted to extend the torment, and this time, SCP-682 wouldn't let him. He regenerated, adapted, and came back ready. 682 developed a number of eyes, far more than before, that remained fixed on SCP-173, paralyzing it. It crawled back up onto the wall and simply stared. Once again, the observing scientists ordered the sharpshooter to take aim and open fire, but this time the bullets had no effect. SCP-682 had developed a thick, clear carapace over the surface of its new eyes, ensuring that nothing would break its eye contact with that murderous little monster. This time, it would not lose. But for all the time that 682 stared, 173 said nothing as always. It just stood there, the strange pattern of its face. That nasty, bloody Rorschach splotch looked almost like a mocking smile. It conceded nothing. It seemed to say, "Go on, get an eyeful. I have all the time in the universe, and everyone looks away eventually. Even you, Atanti Kilpenyu. Let the eternal silence of your brethren be a lesson to you. All you will hear is crunch." 682 kept up the staring contest for 12 hours before it was taken back to its acid bath, thoroughly shaken by its experience. It had always despised its terrible captors, but now a new shade of darkness had entered its narrow emotional lexicon. Fear, true fear. An acknowledgement, deep down in its muscle tissue and guts, that there was something out there that could truly hurt it. The terrible Koitern was alive and thirsty for blood. The researchers who conducted this test considered it an interesting partial success. While 682 was quaking in its tank thinking about 173, they were brainstorming the best move to take next, regarding potential pairings between 682 and 173. A plucky researcher noted that 096 had also gotten SCP-682 on the ropes, so maybe they should send in 173 with a photo of SCP-096 taped to its chest. A member of the O5 Council intervened before this got too far, saying, "No, absolutely not. Setting aside the problem of SCP-682 and SCP-173 that cannot be observed for fear of triggering a response from SCP-096 is a self-perpetuating catastrophe that the Foundation does not under any reasonable circumstances have the slightest desire to unleash. Denied with vehemence." The researcher who suggested this idea felt supremely embarrassed and retired briefly to one of the employee bathrooms to have a good cry before returning to the brainstorming session. Researcher Matus, a more experienced member of personnel, had a stroke of genius. He reminded the assembled researchers that they'd recently performed another semi-successful experiment on 682. Using their deadly high-precision blades, they were able to slice and dice 682 into a series of amorphous blobs. Sure, these blobs may have attacked and killed some D-classes before reforming into the OG nasty reptile, but each of these blobs were the perfect size to be murdered by SCP-173. It eliminated the size differential and put these two on an even playing field. And on that even playing field, it stood to reason that SCP-173 might win. The cross-test was greenlit, and a researcher named Dr. Shenron was put in charge of overseeing the operations. And this time, due to Foundation incompetence and a greater degree of mental preparedness by SCP-682, they were in for a complete disaster. 682 and 173 were brought into the same containment chamber. 682 could feel the latent fear welling up inside itself, so it did the thing that it knew the best. It tried to stoke up its rage, its hatred, the fury and spite that had kept it going through so many torturous attempts on its life. It would not die at the hands of this stone monster. And if it was its destiny, then it would ensure with its dying wretched breaths, it would destroy this terrible beast once and for all. It would shatter it and ensure it never put itself back together. Suddenly, the high-precision blades were deployed. It was an endless volley of cutting that dashed the two deadly anomalies to pieces, like a giant as seen on TV slap chop. Because the machine had been calibrated for its body, 682 was sliced into 12,000 perfect cubes, and 173 had been cut into a pile of lumpy, irregular chunks. A vacuum system was then activated to separate both anomalies into different chambers, so 173 could reform and begin the assault. But miraculously for 682, the vacuum system failed. 2 D-classes were sent in to recalibrate the system, but things quickly got even worse. Many of the 682 cubes formed the same gelatinous masses that they did in the previous high-precision blades test, and began attacking and killing one of the D-classes. The other naturally turned to look at this horrifying display, which meant nobody was paying attention to SCP-173. Immediately, the sculpture reformed and snapped the surviving D-class's neck before turning its attention to SCP-682. The emergency incineration system failed, so all the Foundation could hope for was mutually assured destruction until they got the situation back under control. However, the Foundation had underestimated 682's intelligence and tactical reasoning. While the gelatinous mutated globs of its flesh attacked 173, smashing and cracking its concrete body as it killed and splattered them, the remainder of 682's flesh formed a smaller version of itself, which began staring at 173. This froze the sculpture in place while the mutated flesh monster smashed into it, slowly breaking it down. For the first time in as long as it could remember, 682 felt genuine glee, the thrill of revenge, the glory of an ancient foe vanquished. It would now slay the terrible Koitern, as its ancestors had tried to do so many times before and failed. But this reptile would not fail. Until, of course, the SCP Foundation, monsters that they were, decided to put their finger on the scale. The same Foundation Mobile Task Force sharpshooter, who'd been there during the first 173 cross-test, was still there, still ready to carry out his duties. On the order of the researchers, he fired another 2 shots, blowing out the eyes of this new, smaller 682. While it regenerated its precious eyes, 173 went on a rampage, mercilessly slaughtering every single one of the eyeless blobs of mutated flesh. It smashed each one beyond repair, until only it and the smaller 682 remained. Luckily for 682, its eyes regenerated, complete with the familiar bulletproof covering, just in time to hold back 173 from killing it. The two remained locked in a staring contest of pure hatred for a solid 17 hours before the test was eventually called off. But the horrors continued. Exhausted by the ordeal already, SCP-682 was sedated and returned to its containment chamber without incident, where it regenerated back to its default state. Things weren't so easy with SCP-173. While the team transported it back to its containment chamber, there was a power outage in the hall, and things went dark. And considering SCP-173, in addition to the sculpture and the peanut, could also be nicknamed Instant Killing Spree Just Add Darkness, it won't surprise you to hear there were no survivors. 173 killed everyone in the hall, then escaped out into the wider facility, causing a
Oh,
site-wide
no.
containment breach and a huge number of casualties. The cause of the electrical short that kick-started this massacre was traced back to Dr. Shenron's tampering with the incinerator system. This got the doctor formally reprimanded, stripped of his titles and his memories, and relieved of his duty. But the worst was still very much to come for everyone involved.
I'm remembering now reading, like, SCP stories several years ago and just reading, Dr. Redacted, was reprimanded and Class A amnesiacs were administered. And that, I can just see that, this little scene coming from that text exactly.
Including SCP-682. Because the true terrifying potential of SCP-173 was soon going to be unleashed. And when that happened, nowhere would be safe. On what was otherwise a very normal day, in a very normal procedure when a few D-classes were sent into SCP-173's cell, something extraordinary and terrible happened. SCP-173 multiplied. Like a single-cell organism undergoing mitosis, 173 somehow just split into 2 equal copies of itself.
Ow.
2 D-classes were killed in this first duplication event, but they were just the beginning. Soon enough, people would look back so fondly on the days when there were only a mere 2 of these things. The Foundation and 682, for all their disagreements, are very much alike. Both are always vying for control over their situations, and both achieve this through understanding and adapting to whatever is threatening them. As SCP-173 continued to multiply, the Foundation did what they could to adapt and regain control. They tried to contain specific instances in smaller containment units. They tried to create new methods for permanent observation.
Drones.
They even tried shipping them off to the moon, but none of it did any good. SCP-173 continued to duplicate. They
Why is it doing that, though?
began spreading
What's the
further.
explanation?
They killed 500,000 civilians
In the words
in
of Cardi
48
B,
hours.
what was the
And
reason?
believe us when we tell you, they were just getting started. The ever-growing army of 173 instances went on massive killing sprees every night, taking out huge swaths of the civilian population as they scrambled and panicked in the dark. And they weren't just going after civilians. Evidently, much like 682, 173 had a grudge against the SCP Foundation for all those decades of imprisonment. The 173 army began locating, surrounding, and destroying entire Foundation containment sites, and killing off all the staff and the anomalies inside. Of all the entities in containment that might one day go XK and destroy the world as we know it, not many people had 173 on their bingo card. If only they'd listened to 682's warnings and reallocated their termination resources to 173, things may have turned out differently. And speaking of our scaly old foe, 682 sat in an empty chamber. It'd been days since anyone had come in to check on it. All fled or dead from snapped necks, one of the two. He thought about escaping containment, but given the bloodbaths going on outside all the time, what would even be the point? All that was really left was time. And that was a rapidly depleting resource. He just needed to wait for that thing to come and see him again. SCP-682 blinked, and there it was, standing before him, looking, blink, and there was more, blink. So many of them. So many, blink. Surrounded on all sides by that terrible creature. Too many to fight, too many to win. Just waiting, watching, mocking him. There was only one thing left to do. Blink. Now go check out SCP-173 Origin Story.
What? Okay, hang on now. Hang on. How is that thing multiplying? If anybody who is... I mean, granted, I stopped, like, deep diving into the SCP lore quite a while ago. But how is that thing multiplying? Is there something I don't know about it? Has it always been able to do that? Someone in the comments, if you know, because that just seems like a game-breaking glitch, if you know what I'm saying. If anyone in the comments knows how that thing keeps multiplying, please let me know, because I would like to understand why this story ended this way. Also, because I want the little scaly boy to be okay. Should one be okay? Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. And I'll see you next time.